is a foundational version of the LYT class, the Magic Pelvic Bowl. So it's going to be all about keeping that neutral pelvis as we move. Our pelvis is so important, not only for our posture, but for engagement of that deep core, for keeping the hips, knees, and ankles happy and healthy. This class will have all the elements of a LYT class. Sequences, sun salutations, and stream. We'll just leave out some of the bigger movements and transitions and really focus on that foundational movement and keeping that neutral pelvis. You'll need a block, and we'll start on our back. Go ahead and come to your back. We'll have the block right under the sacrum. So it's going to be on that low back area, low enough that the glutes aren't hanging off. So we want the glutes to still feel like they're engaged here, and we'll really focus on that neutral pelvis. So make sure you don't have an arch in your low back here. So that whole low back, your sacrum is down on the block. And just feel this neutral position for a moment. Notice where your pelvic points are. Let's think about the pelvic bowl. So we've got the front, which is the pubic bone, the sides, which are the ilium, and the back, which is on the block, the sacrum. So that's that bowl. We really want to keep it upright, not letting it tip forward or back. Flex your left hip. So we'll pick up that left foot. Left hip is flexing. That's that ability to get the torso toward the thigh or thigh toward the torso. And we'll really start to firm this right glute. So imagine you were in a bridge pose, really squeezing those glutes. We want the right hip to be active. So not just hanging out, resting. This is an active position. We're just supported with the block. Flex that left foot. We're going to take the left hand and press the left thigh away, creating a little bit of resistance while we do that. So the thigh is pressing into the hand is pressing into the thigh, and we're squeezing that right glute. So right now, as we work that right glute, we're starting to activate the left iliopsoas. So the iliopsoas runs from the inside of that knee through the pelvis and attaches to the back of the pelvis at the sacrum. So it's a really big muscle that goes through a lot of different body parts. It's really important for our posture. It's one of our hip flexors. Go ahead and lower that down. Now recheck. Check that the sacrum is down, back of the skull is down. Pick up that right foot. So we're flexing that right hip, moving the right thigh toward the belly, keeping that sacrum down. Now start to wrap this left glute down as if you were in a bridge pose. So we do want this left glute to be working. As we take the right hand, press that right thigh away. So again, we want to create that resistance. Make yourself work here. As you squeeze that left glute, really press that right hand into the right thigh, pressing the right thigh into the right hand. Might be shaking. Definitely harder than it looks. Working that right iliopsoas now. So it attaches from the inside of the knee up the inner thigh through the pelvis and attaches to the back of the pelvis. Lower that right foot down, pause here. Check in with where the sacrum is. Squeeze your glutes to lift off the block. We're going to remove the block. And as you lower, I want you to do this as slowly as you can. So we'll need the glutes to stay on. We'll need to keep the core active so that you can segmentally lower your upper back down, your middle back. Really squeeze the glutes, control the descent, and the lower back comes down. Once the sacrum comes down, put the block between your thighs or your knees. It can be at any width that feels good. Checking that triple S again. Back of the skull is down, shoulder blades, our scapula, and our sacrum. So we're going to hug that block, which will right away start to get into the inner thighs and the pelvic floor muscles. So we're going to squeeze that block, squeeze your glutes, slowly lift into that very low bridge. So as we lift up into bridge, the low back should feel long. So it's not going to arch. No arch in the low back, which would be tipping the pelvis forward, and it's not going to overly tuck around the low back. So you want to find that happy medium, that neutral pelvis. Make sure your shoulder blades stay down, so we're not lifting so high that our shoulder blades come up. Scapula stays down. Find those two pelvic points, the bony parts at the front of our hips or pelvis. They're called our ASISs. And you're gonna really use the muscles. So imagine that you could draw those two pelvic points in. They're not actually gonna move, but that's that activity we want. Getting that deep core, holding that neutral pelvis, keeping that squeeze in the glutes. Just like we did before, keep those glutes active, keep the core engaged so that you can really slowly lower your upper back, middle back, and lower back all the way until the sacrum comes down. Pause here and just keep the block between your legs. Reach your left palm up toward the ceiling. Right fingers are gonna pull back. So we'll start to stretch and open that left wrist, maybe left forearm. Switch sides, right palm up toward the ceiling. Pull back with the left fingers. Big breaths. Release the stretch. We'll bring the hands behind the head, keeping the block between the legs. Draw your elbows in. So by drawing the elbows in, once we do lift up, it makes it easier to lift up off the shoulder blades. So you want to check that triple S. If you have any arch in your back here, meaning there's any space between your low back and the mat, the pelvis is tipping forward. And if you try to lift up when the pelvis tips forward, you won't have very far to go physically, but also you won't be able to get into these really deep abdominal muscles, those proximal muscles. So we need to hold that sacrum down so that when we do lift up, the effort's coming from that deep low belly. So we'll inhale here, keeping the sacrum down. Exhale, curl up off your shoulder blades. It's a tiny little lift. Chin is toward the throat, so the neck is neutral. Look at those pelvic points, just like we did in bridge, those 2 points right at the front. And visualize that those points could draw toward each other. Hug the block. Inhale to lower. Exhale as you lift. Chin towards your throat, squeeze the block. Look at those two pelvic points. Draw them in. Now imagine you're wearing a corset where your ribs are. Think about tightening that corset in so the ribs really knit in toward each other. Inhale to lower. Exhale as you lift. Chin towards your throat. Make sure the sacrum, the low back, is down. Now look at where your belly button is and imagine that your belly button could pull down, deeper toward the mat. Inhale to lower. Exhale as you lift. Chin towards your throat. Draw those pelvic points in. Knit those front ribs in. Inhale to lower. Release your arms. Remove the block. We're going to come to quadruped. Shoulders will line up right over your wrist. Walk the knees in a little closer. If we're too wide, we're going to tip the pelvis forward. So we always want to think about where our pelvis is. Shoulders line up right over your wrist. We're going to lift the throat. Now imagine that you had a broom behind your back, so we don't want to let the head drop down. We want to lift the throat so that if we had a broom behind our back, it would touch the back of our skull, our shoulder blades, and our sacrum. So keep a lot of this engagement in the core. Even here, think about drawing those two pelvic points in, lifting your pubic bone, the front of your pelvis, up toward the belly button. Slide your left foot back, toes will stay on the ground. Squeeze that left glute here. And then lift up that left leg. Doesn't have to lift very high. We actually don't want it to lift really high because that will tip the pelvis forward. So hold that low back nice and long. Just like in bridge, we don't want it to be arching and we don't want it to be overly tucking or rounding. So we want that nice, happy medium, that neutral pelvis. Flex your foot. Bend that left knee in again. Lift the pubic bone up toward the belly. Arms are going to stay straight and strong and we'll start to pulse this left glute. Which means we're just thinking about lifting that left heel up toward the ceiling. It's a teeny tiny movement. And while you're doing this, I want you to think left glute, left glute, left glute. A lot of times we'll rely on our hamstrings in order to do the job of the glutes. So we really want to focus that brain-body connection on that left glute. And then release it down. Check in with that alignment for quadruped. Shoulders over your wrist. Lift the throat, pubic bone toward the belly button. Slide the right leg back, toes on the ground. Squeeze that right glute. Lift the leg. Bend your knee, flex that right foot. Now again, make sure we're not tipping here. If you tip the pelvis forward, you might feel this more in the knee. So really lift the pubic bone toward the belly. Pulse this right glute. And again, think right glute, so we don't rely on the hamstrings. Our glutes are one of our biggest mover muscles, but among most people, they're one of the 5 weakest muscles. So we really want to use the glutes. They're actually part of the core as well. So the core is everything from the glutes to the shoulders that supports the spine. Release it down. Let's take a child's pose. Take the knees as wide as you'd like. Any option with your arms. Feel that big 360 breath in the rib cage. Ribs expand side to side, front to back. Good. Come back to that quadruped and we'll lift for downward dog. Shoulders over your wrist. Lift your throat, tuck your toes, lift the pelvis straight up, walk your feet forward. If you're used to having your feet way at the back of the mat, we're going to shorten the stance, keeping the weight in the arms. Big bend in your knees. Heels do not have to touch. And we're going to think about lifting our hip creases right where our thigh bone meets the hip. Lift that area right where that hip crease is up toward the ceiling without straightening the legs. So again, anytime our torso or our belly is toward our thigh, that's the action of hip flexion. So we even want that hip flexion here in downward dog. Think about lifting your front ribs up toward the back body so that we're not sinking the chest between the hands, pulling on the shoulders. Good. Hands will walk back toward the feet for a happy squat. Keep a big bend in the knees. Think about that hip flexion as you walk back. Can I keep my torso toward my thighs without rounding the back? So think about that broom behind your back here. Anytime you're hinging or flexing at the hips, use those glutes. Keep squeezing the glutes, rise to stand with that long spine, and walk to the top of the mat. Continuing the reset with Sun Salutation 1. Inhale, reach the arms forward and up. Lift your shoulder blades up towards your ears. Think about that hip flexion as you exhale. Bend your knees. Bend so much that you could get your torso towards your thighs. Fingertips can come to the ground or they can come to a block. Right foot will step back. Lower the right knee and the top of the foot. Lifting up for low lunge. Now let's check that pelvis here. Think about the front of the pelvis, the pubic bone, sides of the pelvis, the ilium, back of the pelvis, the sacrum, and hold that bowl upright. So we don't want it to spill forward. We don't want it to spill backwards. Squeeze this right glute. Remember that feeling of being in that one-legged bridge. Really working the glute. Reach the arms up. Lift the shoulder blades up towards your ears. So anytime our arms are up overhead, our shoulders are in a flexed position. We want to glide the scapula, the shoulder blades up. Plant the hands down. Step your left foot back to quadruped. Now really focus on this position, this weight-bearing position. Lift your throat. Find a position where your shoulder blades aren't puffing up. They're on the back of the ribs. Now think about drawing those pelvic points in, lifting your pubic bone to your belly. Tuck the toes. Lift the hips, downward dog. One breath. Bend the knees. Lift the front ribs. Carefully lower the knees back to quadruped. Right foot will step through your hands. Left knee stays down. Low lunge. Same position we were just in on the other side. Check that upright pelvis. Make sure it's not spilling forward or back. We want to feel like we're zipping the pubic bone, the front of the pelvis, up toward the belly button. Reach the arms up. Find that same glide up in the shoulder blades, really reaching those fingertips up, squeezing this left glute. Lower your hands to the ground or to the block. We're hinging over this right leg. Tuck your left toes. We're gonna step the left foot to meet the right. Left foot steps back into that bent knee forward fold. Think about torso toward the thighs. Rise the arms forward and up. Find that same elevation in the scapula. Glide those shoulder blades up. Exhale, hinge. Think torso toward the thighs, so big bend in the knees. Left foot will step back. Lower the left knee, but not the toes. Lift up, and again, check that pelvic bowl. Zipper that pubic bone up. Draw your pelvic points in. Squeeze this left glute. We're gonna bring the right hand to the pubic bone front of the pelvis, left hand to the sacrum at the back of the pelvis, and just squeeze those hands together. So we're just doing a little compacting front and back, encouraging that neutral pelvis. So every time we put our hands on our body, that's tactile feedback, and that's a great way to communicate with the brain so that you really, in the brain, start to get this movement pattern of a neutral pelvis. Plant the hands down. Step to that quadruped. Lift the throat, draw those pelvic points in. Tuck the toes, downward dog. One breath here, bend the knees, lift the hip creases up, lift the front ribs. Carefully lower back to that quadruped. Left foot steps through, tuck the right toes under. Low lunge again. Check the pelvis. Make sure it's not tipping forward or back. Squeeze that right glute, just like bridge. Imagine those two pelvic points drawing in toward each other. Shoulders are gonna stack right on top of the pelvis. Left hand will come to the pubic bone at the front of the pelvis. Right hand comes to the sacrum at the back of the pelvis. Squeeze those hands together. Imagine that your hands could touch right now. So we're really getting that movement pattern, that brain mapping of holding the neutral pelvis as we're in this low lunge. Lower the hands to the ground or to the block. Now we're hinging over this left thigh. Right foot will step to meet the left foot. Bend your knees in that forward fold. Hinging at the hips, keep that long spine. Press into the feet, rise to stand. Shoulder blades lift up toward the ears. Exhale, lower. Moving on to sequence one. Inhale the arms forward and up. Shoulder blades lift up toward the ears. Exhale, hinge. Think torso to thighs. Right foot will step back. Lower the knee, but not the toes. Lifting for that same low lunge we were just in. Now hands are gonna come to the sides of the pelvis. Find those round bones, your ilium, and now squeeze the hands together here. So this is another way we can encourage that neutral pelvis. Wrap that right glute down toward the heel. So the more we really firm this right glute, the more of a stretch we're gonna get in the front of that right hip flexor. Lower your hands down. You can untuck the right toes. Our left leg will slide back behind us in a three-legged quadruped. So you can start with the toes on the ground again. Lift the throat. Think about that broom behind your back. So make sure we're not dropping anything down. We want everything to feel like it's lifting up and away from the ground. Squeeze that left glute. Lift the leg up. Bend your knee. Now instead of pulsing the glute this time, we're going to keep that squeeze in the left glute and work the hips. So we're going to externally rotate this left hip. So your left knee will move out to the side a little bit, but we don't want it so big that the whole pelvis turns, just the hip. And then we'll internally rotate, so the knee is going to go the other way, a little bit toward the right. Externally rotate. Keep squeezing that left glute. And then internally rotate, kind of like you're trying to corkscrew that left thigh bone. Open it out again. Externally rotate that left hip. Work the outer hip. Internally rotate. Good. Plant that right foot back down. Step back to quadruped. Tuck your toes. Lift up. Downward dog. Lift your hip creases. Lift your front ribs. Walk your hands back to that happy squat. Really think, can I get my torso toward my thighs? Bending my knees, keeping the knees over the ankles. Rise up. Pause here. Hands will come to the sides of the pelvis. Flex that right hip, picking up the foot. It doesn't need to be very high. We're going to externally rotate that right hip so your right knee moves out to the right a little bit. But just like in quadruped just now, don't let the whole pelvis turn, just the hip. And we'll plant it for a low tree. So the toes can either stay on the ground or maybe on that left ankle, left calf. Check in with that pelvic bowl. Remember that feeling of the hands squeezing front and back. Step that right foot down. Flex your left hip. So the left thigh is coming toward the torso. Step it down. Flex your right hip. Right thigh will move toward the torso. Step it down. One more. Flex the left hip. Squeeze that right glute. Step it down. Good. Let's do that sequence on the other side. Inhale the arms up. Exhale, hinge. Hands can come to the block or to the ground. Left foot steps back. Lower the knee but not the toes. Lift up for that low lunge. Squeeze this left glute. Hands come to the sides of the pelvis. Squeeze those hands in like we're compacting the sides of the pelvis together. Make sure your shoulders are stacking over the pelvis, not leaning forward or rounding forward. You can untuck the toes. Hands will lower for quadruped. Shoulders right over the wrist. Right leg extends back. Keep the toes on the ground for a moment. Lift your throat. Lift the pubic bone toward the belly button. Squeeze that right glute. Lift the leg. Bend the knee. Flex the foot. Draw those pelvic points in and don't let the pelvis move as we externally rotate that right hip. So your right knee is going to move out to the right a little bit. And then internally rotate. Right knee starts to move any amount toward the left. Externally rotate. Keep that squeeze in the right glute. Internally rotate. Keep the throat lifted. Externally rotate. Internally rotate. Step that right foot back for a moment. Back to quadruped. Tuck the toes. Downward dog. Take a breath here, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Hands walk back for that happy squat. Big bend in the knee so you can get the torso toward the thigh without rounding your back. Use your glutes as you rise to stand. Flex that left hip. Hands will come to the sides of the pelvis. Without turning the pelvis, externally rotate just that left hip. Plant it for a low tree, so either toes on the ground or low on that right leg. Squeeze that right glute. Remember that feeling of the hands compacting front and back of the pelvis, holding it upright. Step that left foot down. Flex the right hip, so right torso is going to come toward the belly. Step it down. Left foot flexes. Pick up that left foot. Squeeze the right glute. Step it down. One more. Flex the right hip. Squeeze that left glute. Hold that pelvis neutral. Step it down. We're going to do one round of sun salutation A. Inhale the arms forward and up. Glide the shoulder blades up. Big bend in the knees. Think torso toward the thighs as we hinge. Step to a plank pose. We're going to pause in plank, lowering the knees, shoulders right over your wrists. Now squeeze your glutes, they're part of the core. Think about that pelvis, so we don't want it tipping forward, arching the back. Lift the pubic bone toward the belly, draw those pelvic points in, lift the throat up so the head isn't dropping. As you exhale, lower down with control, without letting your shoulders roll forward. So as we lower down, we don't want the shoulders to drop forward. You can untuck the toes, bring the chin toward the throat so your neck is neutral. Now to keep the low back long, we're going to squeeze the glutes, press the pubic bone down into the mat, Imagine that you could lift your belly up towards your low back, and we'll draw the chest through the hands, low cobra. Shoulder blades squeeze in toward each other. Keep that lift in the belly. Good, lift back to downward dog, or you can take child's pose. We'll take 2 breaths wherever you are. If you're in down dog, bend the knees, lift those hip creases up without straightening the legs. So we have that belly to thigh or torso to thigh hip flexion here. Bend the knees, exhale, walk your feet forward. Bend the knees, flex at the hips, think torso toward the thigh. Use your glutes as you rise to stand. Exhale the arms down. Moving on to sequence 2. Standing in that mountain pose, check in with the pelvis, make sure it's not tipping forward or back. Reach the arms forward and up. Shoulder blades lift up toward the ears. Exhale, hinge. We won't come all the way down this time. We're just going to come to that hip hinge. Keep that long spine. Step your right foot back, high lunge or crescent lunge. We're going to bend both knees. Now the right foot does not need to step really far back. We want to make sure that we can keep the pelvis neutral. If we step too far back and get too low, the pelvis is tipping forward. You won't be able to hold neutral here. So walk that right foot in a little bit more if you'd like. Think about that broom touching the back of your skull, your shoulder blades, and your sacrum. Hands will come to the sides of the pelvis again. Give a little squeeze. And we'll load our left foot, meaning we're going to get ready to put our weight onto that left foot. So we need to press into that left foot and really squeeze the left glute. Right foot will tap forward. Squeeze that left glute still. Continue to lift by flexing that right hip. So again, legs coming toward the torso. Tap it down. Step back to that lunge. So maybe make it smaller this time. It doesn't need to step back very far. We want to hold that pelvis upright. Load that left foot, squeeze the left glute, tap the right foot forward. Lift by flexing that right hip. Tap it down one more time. Right foot steps back, crescent lunge, zipper that pubic bone up, squeeze the left glute, tap that right foot forward. Flex, lift that right foot up. Tap it down. We're going to step this right foot back for warrior 2. Check in with the pelvis here. If you feel this in the low back at all, the pelvis is tipping forward. So we want the tailbone to ground straight down and the pubic bone to lift up toward the belly. And we want the glutes to stay really strong. Reach the arms out. Reverse it. Right hand comes down. Right ear releases to the shoulder. Reach that left shoulder blade up. Try to lift it up like we're gliding it up toward the ear. Back to warrior 2. Variation, left forearm to the thigh, right arm comes up and over. Reach that right shoulder blade up, squeeze this right glute. Back to warrior 2. Release your arms. We're going to turn back to the front of the mat. Our right hand will lower onto a block for a twisted lunge. So have the right hand on the block at whatever height feels good. Toes are going to face the front of the mat again, and we'll lower this right knee down. You can untuck the toes if that feels good. Let's focus on that long spine. So we don't want to round the back. If you notice any rounding in the back, bring the block to the highest setting. So we want that long spine. Our left hip crease, right where this left thigh meets the hip, is going to move backwards. So the left hip is in that hinging or flex position where the torso is coming toward this left thigh without the left knee moving forward. The left arm will reach out. We're going to rotate just in the ribs, so don't let anything move in the back of the pelvis or front of the pelvis. Right ear will release to the shoulder. So we're only rotating in the thoracic spine, that upper back area where our rib cage is. Lower that left hand down. You can move the block to the side. Head back to quadruped. Check in here. Shoulders over your wrist. Lift the throat so the head isn't dropping down. Check in with the pelvis. Draw those pelvic points in. Lift your pubic bone towards your belly button. Try to keep all of that engagement as you tuck the toes. Lift for downward dog. So you want to keep that feeling of lifting the pubic bone up toward the belly. Lifting the front ribs up. Exhale, bend your knees. Walk your feet forward. Keep the knees bent, hinging at the hips for that bent knee forward fold. Use your glutes as you rise to stand. Shoulder blades glide up. Lower the hands, second side. Inhale, arms up. Exhale, hinge. We won't come all the way down. We're gonna step that left foot back for that crescent lunge. So it doesn't need to be very far. It could be a really shortened stance. Bending both knees for crescent lunge. Check that the shoulders are right over the pelvis. Make sure there's no tipping forward or back. Squeeze this left glute. Hands will come to the sides of the pelvis, right around that ilium, that round bone, and squeeze the hands in. We're gonna do that tapping forward and tapping back. So really get that right leg ready. We're gonna be loading and standing on that right leg. So use that right glute. Tap the left foot forward. Flex the left hip. Think about bringing that left thigh toward the belly. Tap it back down. Step back to that high lunge. Hold that pelvic bowl upright. Tap the left foot forward. Squeeze that right glute. Continue to lift by flexing that left hip. Tap it down. We'll do that one more time. High lunge. Shoulders over the pelvis. Tap the left foot forward. Flex the hip. Belly toward the thigh. Tap it down. Left foot steps back, warrior two. Check in with that pelvic bowl. So if it's tipping forward and we're arching the low back, again, think about the pubic bone, front of the pelvis, zippering or lifting up toward the belly, squeezing the glutes, reach those arms out. So you have to keep the glutes strong as we move so that we don't relax and tip the pelvis. So you have to hold that engagement to keep the pelvis neutral. Reverse it. Let the left ear release to the shoulder. Try to reach that right shoulder blade up, getting more length along the right side of the ribs. Warrior two. Variation, forearm to your thigh. Left arm up and over. Think about drawing those pelvic points in here as you squeeze the left glute. Back to warrior two. We're gonna turn to the front of the mat. Twisted crescent, left hand will come to the block. Lower the left knee. You can keep the toes tucked or untuck them. Think about that broom behind your back. So have the block as high as you need so that we don't round the back. Right hip crease, right where that right thigh, our right femur meets the right hip. Move that right hip back so that our torso is hovering over this right thigh. Our right hip is in flexion. Right arm reaches out. Without turning or moving in the pelvis, rotate just where the rib cage is. 1 or 2 inches, it's a small rotation. Left ear releases to the shoulder. Lift the belly up. Lower that right hand. You can remove the block. Step to quadruped and pause here. Shoulders over your wrist. Lift your throat. Draw those pelvic points in. Lift the pubic bone to the belly. Keep that feeling as you tuck the toes. Lift for down dog. Let the knees bend as much as you need. Don't force the heels down. Lift the front ribs up. Lift the hip creases up for more of that hip flexion. Exhale, bend your knees. Walk your feet forward. Hinge at your hips. Belly toward the thigh. Keep that long spine. Rise to stand. Release the arms down. Moving on to the stream, the last part where we sequence the first and second sequences together, so we really get it in our brain mapping, all of those things we've worked on, that hip flexion, that neutral pelvis, that long spine, and we'll take it into some bigger movements and transitions. Reach the arms forward and up, shoulder blades glide up, hinge at the hips, think belly toward the thighs, big bend in the knees. Right foot steps back, lower the knee but not the toes. Lift for that low lunge. Wrap that right glute down, zipper the pubic bone up. We're gonna goal post the arms. So our arms are gonna bend, coming out to the side. Elbows come right out of the shoulders. Think about that broom behind your back, so make sure we're not rounding here. Long spine. Lower the hands down. You can untuck those right toes. We're gonna head back to that three-legged quadruped. Left leg extends back, toes will start on the ground. Squeeze that left glute. Lift the pubic bone toward the belly. Lift the leg, bend the knee, flex the foot. Keep that left glute really active as we externally rotate the left hip. Knee moves out to the side. Make sure it's small so the pelvis doesn't turn. And then internally rotate like we're spiraling that left thigh over toward the right. Externally rotate, make sure the pelvis doesn't move. Internally rotate, lift your throat. Externally rotate. Internally rotate. Tap the left toes back. Quadruped. Check in with the pelvis here. Make sure it's not tipping forward. Lift the pubic bone up. Tuck your toes. Downward dog. One breath here. Bend the knees and walk the feet in as much as you need. Lift the hip creases. Hands walk back towards your feet as the heels lower for happy squat. Hinge at the hips. Think torso toward the thigh. Rise up. Tree pose. Right hip flexes, lift the right foot. Externally rotate, step it for tree. Lift the pubic bone toward the belly button. Squeeze that left glute. Hands at the sides of the pelvis. Step the right foot down. Flex the left hip. Lift up that left foot, squeeze the right glute. Step it down. Hold the pelvis neutral as you flex the right hip. Step it down. Flex the left hip. Step it down. Right foot will step back for warrior two. Check that pelvic bowl here. Make sure it's not tipping forward, tipping back. Reach the arms out. Reverse it without the pelvis moving. Lift that left shoulder blade up. Squeeze the right glute. Back to warrior two. Variation, left forearm to the thigh, right arm comes up and over. We're gonna pause here. Squeeze that right glute. Think about lifting these left ribs away from that left thigh, so we're really lifting up into the right side body. We've got a bigger transition here. We're gonna backstroke this right arm. So we're gonna circle it back, and as it sweeps down, we're gonna turn our body back to the front of the mat. Step this right foot to chair pose. Hinging at the hips. Make sure the pelvis isn't tipping here. Zipper the pubic bone up toward the belly. Hands will come to the heart. Straighten your legs. Flex that right hip, pick it up. Squeeze that left glute. Now just like in that twisted crescent, we're gonna turn just in the rib cage, so nothing in the pelvis. Turn maybe 1 or 2 inches toward the right. Keep squeezing that left glute. Just the thoracic spine's rotating. Come back to center. Step it down. Second side for the stream. Reach the arms forward and up. Shoulder blades lift. Exhale, hinge, big bend in the knees. Left foot steps back. Lower the knee, but not the toes. Low lunge. Remember that feeling of the hands squeezing the front and back of the pelvis together. Squeeze that left glute. Goal post the arms. So we're getting a nice open feeling in the chest in front of the shoulders. Check in with the pelvis. Check in with the low back. Lower the hands. You can untuck the left toes. Heading to that three-legged quadruped. Right toes land on the mat behind you. Lift your throat. Think about that broom behind your back. Squeeze the right glute as you lift the leg. Bend your knee, flex the foot, zipper that pubic bone up so we're not tipping. Externally rotate the right hip, right knee moves out to the right. Internally rotate, right knee moves a little bit to the left. Externally rotate, draw those pelvic points in. Internally rotate, press evenly into the hands. Externally rotate. Internally rotate. Right toes come back to the ground. Step into quadruped for a moment. Draw those pelvic points in, lift the throat. Tuck the toes, downward dog. One breath here. Bend the knees as much as you'd like. Lift the hip creases, lift the front ribs up. Hands walk back into that happy squat toward the feet. Sit back into the hips, use your glutes. Rise to stand with that long spine. Flex the left hip. Squeeze that right glute. Externally rotate the left hip without turning the whole pelvis. Plant it for that low tree. Check in with that pelvis. Make sure it's not tipping forward or back. Step the left foot down. Flex the right hip. Left glute is strong. Step the right foot down. Flex the left hip. Right glute is strong. Step the left foot down. Flex the right hip. Step it down. Left foot steps back, warrior two. Reach the arms out. Now even here, remember that feeling of the hands squeezing the front and back of the pelvis together. Glutes stay active, reverse it. Left ear releases to the shoulder. Try to lift that right shoulder blade up. Warrior two. Variation, forearm to your thigh. Left arm up and over. Think about knitting those front ribs in. Squeeze that left glute. Here's that big transition. Circle this left arm back as we sweep it down. Turn toward the front of the mat. Left foot steps for chair. Make sure we're not tipping forward or back. Hands to the heart. Use your glutes to stand. Flex the left hip. Right glute is on. Now again, we don't want to move anything in the lower body. So think about just where the rib cage is. Turn 1 or 2 inches to the left. Holding here. Think about that broom behind your back. Make sure we're not rounding. Come back to center. Step it down. Release your arms. Let's cool down. Head to quadruped. Take a few rounds of cat-cow. Stretching it out, letting the pelvis tip forward and back as the rest of the back moves. Come onto your back. We'll have the knees bent, feet on the mat, checking that triple S. Back of the skull is on the mat, shoulder blades and sacrum. We'll flex that left hip, so pick up your left foot as if the belly was coming toward the thigh, but hold that sacrum down. Now we'll do that external rotation we practiced. Just the hip rotates. Cross it over that right thigh. Keep the sacrum down. If it feels good, take the left hand to the left thigh and just try to rotate that left thigh bone a little bit more. So we're encouraging a little bit more of that external rotation for the left hip by almost just kind of trying to swivel that left thigh. Stick with that, or you can goal post the arms, keeping the scapula down, those front ribs knitting in. And we'll maybe lift up that right foot to go deeper into that left hip stretch. Taking a few breaths here if you want to add some gentle rocking. Feel free to move a little bit more. Release that right foot down, then the left foot. Let's switch sides. Check that the sacrum is down, so we've got that neutral pelvis, neutral spine. Pick up the right foot, so we're flexing the right hip, bringing the thigh toward the torso. Externally rotate, so that right hip is externally rotating. The right ankle will cross near that left thigh. Draw those pelvic points in. Start with a little bit more of that external rotation. So however you want to do it, as gently as you want, you can use both hands, but we're just going to encourage that right hip to externally rotate a little bit more. Stick with this or goal post the arms. Make sure the scapula stays on the mat and maybe lift up that left foot. So that's a bigger stretch for the right thigh. If that's ever too much, lower that left foot back down. Do a little gentle rocking if that feels good. Release that left foot down, then the right foot. Coming into Shavasana, take any option. Feet can stay on the mat. You can extend the legs out. Take a few moments to get settled into whatever position you're in. Closing your eyes. Soften your jaw. Relax your forehead. Taking a few more deep breaths here. Or stay here in Shavasana as long as you'd like.